Hi everyone, I'm George Coors, and let's talk about Terra Nostra by Carlos Fuentes. I'm super excited to talk about this novel. This is a really deeply experimental novel, and Fuentes, I think, when it comes to the act of constructing a piece of art, the act of constructing a piece of literature, had some significant talent and flexes all of those talents in this novel. It is a long one, and it is deeply, deeply experimental. Every single page has something that is baffling in this novel. And if you are a reader and you aren't super into experimental works, I want to encourage you to try. I really love that kind of art. I really love art that leaves us asking more questions than it gives us answers. And that, as a writer, as a novelist, that's what I'm trying to do, is to get us to this place where we're engaging in that question asking. And I think Carlos Fuentes with Terra Nostra is doing that labor, is doing that work. Fuentes, a Mexican novelist, a little near and dear to my heart. He spent a little bit of his youth in Washington D.C., so that's important to me. But as a writer of fiction, Fuentes, man, this novel, it is a behemoth, if I may say so. There is so much going on in this work that, well, we're just going to have to get into it and go through it. Um, this is a novel, I will admit, that the first time that I read through this, I did not finish this work. I read through it. I wasn't in the right headspace. You can see all the notes that I took on my second read, though. It was really, it was one of those things where the first time I read through it, I wasn't quite there. And then I later became ready to read it, and I'm so glad that I did. And I'm going to be thinking about and rereading this novel for the rest of my life, I imagine. Um, and there's a lot of, I think, really productive and interesting experimentation that goes on here in the sense that on the surface, we sort of get what appears to be a pretty standard looking structure. And then once we get into the text, we really unearth so much of what is going on here and just how deeply complicated everything that Fuentes did is here. But I want to read from the introductory essay, which is titled Seven Notes on Carlos Fuentes Terra Nostra, which is by Jorge Volpe and was translated by Cesar Valverde. And I want to read, if you have your copy out, in my pagination, it is in Roman numeral 13, note 4, or I'm sorry, end of note 3. Um, In the area of Latin American literature, Terra Nostra undoubtedly constitutes the riskiest literary battle of our time. Haughty and brave, Fuentes invents a new aleph in which historical times and the limits of knowledge are erased or fade away, giving way to a mythical space in which all eras and all humans cohabitate and where the present and the future cancel each other out. A step beyond the historical novel, Fuentes' work is a novel against history. And that is a fantastic summation of this work. What we have going on here, most superficially, is a three-part novel about King Felipe II of Spain. Um, Translated by Margaret Sayers Pedden. It is incredibly complex and it's very long. This Dalkey Archive edition clocks in at almost 800 pages. And the translation itself by Sayers Pedden, I I like. It is, however, not free of controversy because the translation of the title of one of the sections is allegedly mistranslated. So there's three sections of the work. The first is the Old World. The second, after that, is the New World. And then the third is the Next World. Now, the Next World is, in some literature that I have read, um, intended to be translated as the Other World. Um, Now, I'm not aware if there's any other translations in the English, but if you're reading this in German or French or any of its other translations, let us know in the comments down below what that third section of the novel is titled, because that would be very interesting for me to learn. And King Felipe II is this sort of focus of the novel itself. Um, Felipe, otherwise known as El Señor, um, is in the process of building El Escorial, which is this sort of palace, monastery, multi-use capstone of his reign. And much like the construction of El Escorial, the novel is constructed and extremely architectural. Starting off in this old world section, this first section, it just opens on some really bizarre, surreal scenes, and it is one of these things where I think the reader, in the first 20 pages or so, is probably going to be taken aback by what is going on here. The beginning feels a little dystopian, feels very dystopian, and is the kind of cold open that I think might really make some readers step back. Once you get through that, and once we get to King Felipe II, we begin to delve into a little bit of that the early thematic concerns that Fuentes is digging into here. That specifically being the transition from the medieval to the enlightened period, from the medieval to the colonial project. And the reader might feel a little whiplash because the opening scenes are set like in almost like a present day Paris, where sort of a almost apocalyptic, maybe Book of Revelations type event is occurring. And then we're snapped back significantly to several centuries later to Felipe II in Spain. And this is the first indication of the use of time here. And Volpe commented on that in what I just read. But one of the biggest things that I think is going to be here with readers and is going to be a part of your experience is what is happening with regards to time, the passage of time, how time occurs, the speed at which time occurs. Because we see recursive loops in the novel, we see significant back and forth, we see really some questions where maybe time doesn't even matter at all. This is one of those things where a lot of novels sort of teach you how to read them as you go. And with experimental fiction, we sort of get into this place where we begin to learn what to expect as a reader, as a consumer of this art. And fully, Fuentes, in that scene where we're going from Paris back to Felipe and the concerns about the medieval, it's probably might sound very daunting, but this is just encouraging the reader, in my mind, to let go of our very reasonable expectations regarding chronological time. And that is going to be a major thing, I think, for most readers here. Is I think chronological time, what constitutes the past, all of that is thrown into question in Terra Nostra. And I don't think that it's bad to brush up against that or have a difficult time with that, because I think to a certain extent that is maybe a little bit of the intentionality behind what eventually happens throughout the rest of the novel and how time operates. And as a reader, I think it is good to sort of go into this novel with the understanding of just how not only fluid but rigid at the same time time can be that's very contradictory, but as you read through the novel, it will be contradictory, without a doubt. There are a ton of contradictions in this novel, not only about time. And I think one of the prevailing sort of images that we see throughout the novel is really enlightening for me as a reader when it comes to thinking about like time in the work. Um, that is specifically like the imagery of night and day. Each of our sections, the old world, the new world, and the other world, or the next world, as is translated by Sayers Pedden, um, each have a section that focuses on night and day, and each have a section that is 7 parts long. Um, so in the first part, we have the 7 stages of night, which is right at the end. And then in the new world, we have the day and night sections also at the end. That's also 7 sections long. And then in the other world, we have El Señor recalling the 7 days. And I think one of the first sort of readerly impressions that I'm going to give here about Terra Nostra is really we see like some common narratives caught in these loops where they're reiterated, retold, reframed by other characters. It is a hugely polyphonic novel. I've just brought up King Felipe II. I think that's because that a lot of his action and his views on the medieval versus the Enlightenment versus the colonial project, a lot of that is deeply intertwined with a lot of the overarching action of the characters. But in part 1, in the old world, this sort of prevailing philosophical quandary begins to be intertwined with how time functions. So El Señor, King Felipe, refers to El Señor, his father, and this is another sort of breakdown in time in terms of which El Señor are we talking about in several parts of the novel, and that can be very dense and difficult to get through. Because we're looking at heritage, lineage, a lot of sort of old world European royalty concerns with that come a lot from that sort of medieval courtly culture, and it is pretty dense. The other thing outside of time that I think the first section really throws the readers into is the madness of the human experience. I think in the sort of more historical novel sections where we are talking about the Spanish royal court and El Señor and his various attendants and his queen, and the queen's representatives, we are observing a really extreme and grotesque madness. And I think at its heart, for me, what I'm reading here is a larger class commentary about royalty and wealth and generational wealth. That I think I do think is like really it would be heavy handed if it weren't so maddening in and of itself to read, because I think when you're reading through Terra Nostra, a lot of the symbolism is not necessarily subtle, but things are so surreal and disjointed that we do as readers have a little trouble navigating what goes where. And I think the inclination here might be for some readers to say, "Oh, well, we're talking about magical realism," and I think that is fine, but I don't think that's exactly what's happening here with Carlos Fuentes and Terra Nostra. And if you are a magical realist expert, get in the comments below and talk a little bit about that if you've read this novel, because I would be interested in hearing more commentary there about that. But what I think is happening here is actually a novel that is built much more on contradiction. just in terms of experience, um, I do really think Terra Nostra, you know, in terms of how I experienced it, page for page, was probably more challenging than some other large, weighty 20th century novels that we might think of. One that I had pulled out sort of recently that I was thinking of was Gravity's Rainbow by Thomas Pynchon. I think Terra Nostra might make a read of something like Gravity's Rainbow seem a little easier, actually. I think past a certain threshold, art is just so complicated. But what is happening in Terra Nostra with King Felipe and the construction of El Escorial is so blindingly complicated. Um, and it is really, really provocative. I think in this part one, in the old world, the novel is constructing itself, much like King Felipe, El Señor is constructing El Escorial. We see the sort of novel begin building, and I think you do get a very architectural sense when you look through a novel like this. If you're the kind of reader who is going through and paying attention to how many chapters there are, or how long something is, or how many times something occurs, if that's something that you're reading, um, there is so much of that in this work, where there's intentional like placement of numbers, or a particular symbolic character recurs, or a particular symbolic narrative occurs. And you begin, I think, even if you're not the reader who does that, I think you begin to notice the novel sort of being constructed around you in that sort of intellectual space. It's it's incredibly puzzling. The the old world section has so many voices, and so many desires, and so much grotesque violence, um, that I think, it operates on sort of multiple levels. The class commentary of the madness is evident for me. I think there's also a historical commentary on European history and the violence and grotesque brutality of European history. I think the violence, especially in sections one and section two, I think those might be a little hard to stomach for readers. Um, it's not. I wouldn't say it's as violent as some other novels, but there is, you know, we're talking about, late medieval, early Enlightenment period European history, an incredibly violent era. Talking about the colonial project, perhaps the most violent cultural project exercised in the history of humanity. There's a couple other that come to mind, but the colonial project is certainly up there. Um, and all of this intertwined is really, it's a cacophony. It is so loud. The novel is ceaseless. Every page is something new, and I do think it's puzzling in a really great way. I think if you're a reader who's like delving into, I like to read for symbolism, this is another thing that I think is really, really great. I think you would have a really excellent time reading this. It's it's difficult though. It's perverse. Conceptually, it's difficult, and there's just, so much going on in terms of the structure. And I'll just show you like how many, in the old world, how many chapters there are. I mean, it is just chapter after chapter after chapter, um, and who gets to narrate and when the narration occurs, it can't is we're going between narrators very frequently. And I think if you're challenged by unreliable narration, then there is maybe no challenge greater than right here, because it is clear, frequently it is clear who is narrating what. However, multiple characters occur multiple times. I mentioned earlier that King Felipe and his father are both referenced as El Señor. Um, we see iterations of characters happening in multiple timelines throughout this novel. Um, I think, that's one of those things where it causes the reader to pause. It caused me to pause and say, okay, let me just take a beat here and see what I can make of this, see what I can get of this. I think, all of this, what I've described here in, the first 20 minutes of this video, all of this sounds like really, really daunting. But I do believe, stick with me on experimental literature, because I think that, in my opinion, we sort of owe it to this kind of art to engage in it, even if, our understanding is not in a place that we would say it's like expert. Even a passive understanding, even just attempting to critically engage in a work like this, I think is really, really important, because it shows so many complex perspectives, and there's so many different readings, that I think it is really an enriching experience, even if, it's a baffling one. And the reason why I think this novel is extremely worth your time, and I'm going to try not to do this on the channel where I recommend reading novels, but I love it, so I'm going to do it. Is in section 2, the New World, and the New World. This tale. First off, I'm sure the New World is the shortest of the sections. And this section, the New World, is a really surreal, complicated retelling of a lot of Central American and Mexican mythological creation stories. And I really want to, if you are like, if Mexican mythology is your thing and you are really, really into it and you have read this novel, I want you to comment down below, and recommend some reads for us, because there is so much going on there where, like Volpe says, this becomes mythological. This novel in the second part all of a sudden becomes mythological, and it becomes huge because we begin to encounter the colonial project in a major way. In a lot of ways, this is, the New World section is kind of a Cortez retelling, where we're retelling the early colonial project of Spain. And it is, that shortest section, the New World, I think is perhaps the most baffling section, because of how much is going on here, how much layered symbolism there is. And then the other aspect of it, which I think is really provocative and why I think this novel is essential for us to read, is its commentary on cultural hybridity. I think we see characters engaging in this sort of like mishmash of various cultural mythologies and cultural expressions that all of a sudden begin exerting something new in history and exerting something new in time. And that, to me, is this huge overarching commentary on, all of us who are the descendants of, settler colonizers coming to North America, coming to South America, and experiencing these new varying cultures, and developing those new varying cultures. There's so much to dig into there. It is unfathomably complicated. And by the time I got to the New World, I was just enamored with this novel. I was at a point where I think, for me, it became so political, so deeply cultural, and just so, I think, important to what those contemporary experiences are, where our cultures arise from, how we sort of think about ourselves as individuals in this, unceasing timeline, of, chaos and violence and grotesque, bizarre choices, and strange philosophies. And, ping-ponging back and forth between time and between the characters here, we do get sort of lost in what we are. I think Carlos Fuentes in portraying the colonial project, if we could be so reductive to say something like that, um, really does, to my mind, a fantastic job of just letting you loose and letting you pull at strings in a novel and see where you go, letting you get lost in this sort of figurative maze of El Escorial that King Felipe is constructing. It is really interesting. In part two, the New World, there is a character known as the Pilgrim. I read the Pilgrim as a human manifestation of the colonial project itself, and you know that was sort of my reading of just this corporeal version of settler colonialism, engaging with mythology and engaging with time and engaging with the various philosophies that Fuentes posits in that New World section. The New World section of the novel itself goes from 351 to 478. It's pretty short. It is quite the discourse, in terms of, especially about cultural hybridity, to my mind. Um, I think, this sort of reimagining of like a Cortez type narrative is really something that I think a lot of readers, who are interested in post colonialism, might really benefit from. If that's your thing, if you're really interested in post colonial literature, how we approach, what does it mean to be post colonial, what does it mean to be a cultural hybrid, what does it mean to inhabit those liminal spaces. I think the New World section of this novel, you can't miss. There's so much to dig into there that I think it would really be an important read, for folks who are interested in that sort of material. And that brings me to the third part, which is the next world, or otherwise translated as the other world. And a third character that I'd like to mention. So in the old world, we're in medieval Spain. We're focusing somewhat on King Felipe II and the building of El Escorial. We're really, I think, thematically deep into this discussion of transitioning from the medieval to the enlightened. We see the opening of the colonial project. It's a major shift in European history, in world history, of course, as European countries begin the colonial project in the Enlightenment period and begin sort of extracting resources, and exerting violent military power all across the world. Then in the New World, we are in Mexico. We are in a place where we are going through these sort of mythological retellings. And again, going back to what I was talking about earlier with reliable narration, if reliable narration is something that's a must for you, this is probably a pass, because we don't really know who we can trust at all. That's evident throughout it. And I think that there's a big commentary on, do we trust our own memories there? But nonetheless, we get all of these mythological retellings sort of intertwined. Some seem erroneous, some seem faithful. It's very complex. And then we have our third section, the other world, or the next world. The character I would highlight there is Celestina. Celestina appears in part one as well. But Celestina is this almost sort of symbolic character of Mother Nature, of purity, and she factors in very much so into that third section of the novel. And their narration in this third section of the novel, it really spirals. And actually, I wrote down in my notes where I think the novel begins to spiral, and I think it begins to spiral, in my opinion, And again, if you've read this, comment down below what your opinion is. But the novel really begins to spiral in on page 569. Um, we just the last 200 pages are a free ride almost. It is like free jazz in a lot of senses here. Um, because we have El Señor narrating, we have Celestina narrating. We see characters from other significant Spanish language novels. Don Quixote is here. Oscar Oliveira from Hopscotch is here, among others. And we have our third 7 days section. Um, and it is out of control in a really fantastic way. I think maybe I don't think I'm overselling how puzzling this novel is, but I really do think that it is just at this point you have been, as the reader, taught in the first 568 pages. What to expect from Fuentes, where to go. And this is why I say, if you're new to experimental literature, give yourself some grace, because over those first 500 pages, you're going to be sort of, either quickly or slowly taught how to read the novel, and then those last 200 pages spiral significantly. Let me read a, um, a small quote from page 771 of The Next World, or The Other World. Would you dare think the unthinkable as you stand and hold back the drape with your only hand? Are you looking at a transposition of the historic past into a future that will have no history? These are the kinds of questions and the kind of almost intellectual madness that we are dealing with time and time again throughout this novel. You may notice, here we are 30 minutes in, I haven't talked much about plot. I do think there is a little, there's plot here, to be sure. But for our very plot-centric readers, I think you should challenge yourself, and I think you should read a novel like this. Because I think it really does force you to try to unpack what this idea of plot is and where it's coming from. Because I do think that there are some microcosmic little plots in here. There's some plot. There's significant plot with Guzman, who is King Felipe II's attendant, in the political machinations in history there. There's plot with King Felipe's wife, known as the Mad Woman, and her attendants. There's also significant plot with Celestina and Celestina's history. Obviously, the Pilgrim, has their own journey. And so there's those little smaller plots. And then we have macrocosmic plot lines as well. The plot of world history, the plot of the colonial project, or Europe transitioning from the Enlightenment over, to the colonial project, or even further back from medievalism into the Enlightenment. And the sort of cross-comparing plot of which of those philosophies is actually ethical or meaningful in some way. And then we also have, these sort of macrocosmic ideas of heritage and cultural hybridity. El Señor wants to separate himself from El Señor, his father. Can he do that? How is that possible? Physically and intellectually, I'll say. And I don't think that's a big spoiler. I think there's a ton going on there. And how you establish your own legacy independent of the people who came before you. Pretty baffling stuff. I think tip to tail, this is one of those novels that I think demands a lot of attention. It is definitely a time crunch in terms of its length, but also I think just in terms of concept. At a certain point with some of these novels, either you're devoting years to reading it line by line, or you're accepting that maybe this time when you read it, we're not going to get everything. Nor do I think that it's possible for anybody, if they spend their whole lifetime on one novel, to get everything. Again, I think Fuentes is leaving us with many more questions than answers, and that's a good thing. that merits a reread. That merits a revisit. That merits, saying, oh, I was thinking about Terra Nostra today, and just picking it up and reading the whatever page you flip to. I think that is a really critical and thoughtful way to engage in this sort of experimental literature, and I think Terra Nostra is a great way to get into that. I do think it's an experimental novel that deserves more attention than it's gotten. I think it's gotten a pretty decent amount of attention. But I think when folks are talking about, if you are, talking about Gravity's Rainbow or whatever, I think, Terra Nostra's right there, if not more baffling than Gravity's Rainbow. There's a lot of really, I think, if you're just trying to read thematically here and you're trying to, get into a novel like this, there's some imagery that I think might be very helpful to sort of think about as a new reader to Terra Nostra and get into. First and foremost, I would say just embrace the surreal nature of it. Time doesn't work in the way that a clock does in this novel. That is just how it is. And I think that accepting that early on, embracing how surreal that can be, is a really great idea. Embracing the notion of metafiction, that there is going to be characters from other novels here, of course, but also that our characters are going to be characters again. So, King Felipe, Celestina, we see multiple images of these characters, and that is something that is important to accept, is that sort of metafictional aspect. In addition, a huge one is the mythological aspect here, embracing that sort of, and I think this is where folks might be inclined to say, oh, magical realism, we're getting mythological. I don't think it operates on that same wavelength, but, let me know if you feel that way. But the mythological retellings I did not read as magical realism. Those I read as this sort of macrocosmic arch of time. That is very important for us to think about. And, again, I keep reiterating, but ask yourself the question, what is time, as you're reading this novel? Because I think that is going to be a really enlightening thing. Another thing that I would say be prepared for is polyphonic voices, and who is narrating and how the narration occurs, because you do explicitly enter in somebody's narration very frequently, and what I mean by that is there are many scenes where a cast of characters are gathered around, and then they listen to one person, and then that is the narration for the next several chapters. Celestina does that. The Pilgrim does that. El Señor does that. So you get these different instances where it's almost like oral history, that you're listening to somebody reiterate this thing. And very frequently, they might be reiterating the same narrative yet again. So very polyphonic. There's one set of imagery that I really enjoyed, which I would leave for you readers, which is the image of the hand mirror and the image of reflection. There is, to me, I was reading a lot about how we're reflecting on ourselves, and about how, we're reflecting on our own history and everything that's going into our own perception of ourselves. And the hand mirror occurs time and time again. I gotta show everybody. These were all of my notes here on the hand mirror, and you see just time after time over the course of hundreds of pages, the hand mirror comes up as this symbol, allowing the characters to reflect on themselves, reflect on others, reflect on history. Maybe the mirror is warped and it casts an impure reflection. So much going on with sort of reflection and imagery here. Cultural hybridity, as I mentioned before, is a huge through line here, and just sort of thinking about what constitutes cultural hybridity and who says what, when, where, and why. Tons of stuff going on there with that, and I think that that's something that's really important to this novel, from sort of a cultural political intersection. And another thing that I would say here is art, physical art, like paintings, and I haven't talked much about that, but that is evident throughout the work that there are you know some pretty significant works of art that inspire different characters, and there is a like particular artistic image that El Señor returns to time and time again. Um, and I think that is really provocative, really interesting stuff throughout there. Is that you know the painting as a cultural artifact, becomes this sort of recursive thing where we're thinking about it over and over again, and thinking about that in different ways, and where does that lead us, and what does this image mean to us, and what does this image mean in and of itself. And I think that there's a ton going on there with that. Another thing that I'd say is a big part of Terra Nostra, and is also probably larger part of the Fuentes sort of general vibe, is the use of cinematic technique. I think we see that in the narration here quite a bit as well. Is that there's that sort of influence of film. Um, and I do think that is almost cliched to talk about a novel being not being filmable, um, and I do think not to engage in that old cliche discourse, but this novel absolutely is not filmable, and I think a filmmaker reading this novel might be deeply jealous of what Terra Nostra is able to do to a person consuming art. I think that for me, that's one of the things. That's why I'm a novelist. Is I've never encountered a form of art that can do everything that a novel can do. And Carlos Fuentes, no matter how you read this novel, if you go from beginning to end, that is clear. It is the ability to use the novel in different ways, and to mediate that artistic expression in really thoughtful ways is astounding. And Fuentes died in 2012, but I gotta say, congratulations to the man on having authored a work like this, because this is baffling in the right ways. Absolutely excellent. So let's talk about some recommended reads that I have based off of this. Um, I have recommended a few previously. There's one I'm going to pull from the shelf actually, that I recommended on a previous video, and that is The Location of Culture by Homi Bhabha. And I think this is key. Sort of theoretical work that might be really enlightening. And I think if you were reading Homi Bhabha and then reading Terra Nostra, or vice versa, I think that you would have a really excellent time. Um, it is cited that he largely based sort of the concept here on James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. Um, I do think that I see the parallel here significantly. Um, I think that it would be, yeah, I have been on again, off again reading this novel for the last 12 years. And I'm almost halfway through it now. And I'm seeing the parallels significantly, and I was so glad to see that, to have read Terra Nostra first, because I think it does the absurdity of time is so significant here, and where Joyce and Finnegan's Wake is so absurd in the language. um, you know Time is really, I think, time and madness, and the psychology of everything is really Carlos Fuentes' bread and butter, and I was really impressed to see, and I'm still impressed to see those interactions between the two novels, particularly imagery of night and day. There's a lot of sort of night and day imagery in Terra Nostra time and time again, and that is also the case in Finnegan's Wake. I recommended Terra Nostra in the 2666 video, and I'll do the same in reverse here. I think that 2666 in cross comparison, which is the novel that I think is more maddening? I think for me personally, um, it's gonna be Terra Nostra, time and time again. But I think Terra Nostra also gets at that brutality of humanity aspect that 2666 is delving into. And I think there's just so much to unpack there of like not being able to escape the brutality of human history and the future of humanity being brutal as well. It's a grim perspective, but I think in Terra Nostra that also rings true. Because as a historical novel and King Felipe being this historical character, there's no way to separate him from the sort of absolutely brutal, violent history of himself and his family. And Europe at that time, of course, there is no way to separate it out. And my last recommended read, based off of all this, might be a little bit of a controversial one, actually, but I'll be interested to hear you taking it. And that is War and Peace by Count Leo Tolstoy. I think War and Peace is this huge, hulking historical novel. And for me, I was getting actually quite a bit of overlap between the two, in large part because they really delve philosophically into just what is going on and underpinning, these characters. Where's my last notes there? These characters' feelings. But it's not the narrative of War and Peace that necessarily got me there. The historical narrative part, like I said, this philosophical thread throughout War and Peace, and the commentary that Tolstoy has about what is history and what constitutes writing a good history. That sort of feeling, particularly towards the end here. When there's all this commentary on what informs a good historian, as the historian is a person in history who's authoring something. Those threads, those deeply philosophical, historical, and almost metaphysical threads that are throughout War and Peace. That reminded that I found a connection with Terra Nostra there, in large part because we are reminded as we go through of Terra Nostra about how King Felipe II is this almost symbolic shift from the medieval to the Enlightenment period, and his significant interactions with opposing Protestantism, his interactions with the colonial project. These are representing a new historical era. And that new historical era is fraught with its own complexities. Much like the historical shift that's occurring here with Napoleon Bonaparte and his rise in Europe and eventual downfall. So in terms of like seeing like symbolic unpacking and also very real historical unpacking and philosophical unpacking of major shifts in European history, both of these novels sort of got there for me on that, and definitely reminded me of that. I think overall, I think Terra Nostra is a worthy experimental novel to be in any discussion that folks are having with Finnegan's Wake, for example, one of its source novels, and of course, any sort of contemporary 20th century fiction where we're talking about, if you're talking about Thomas Pynchon or Samuel Beckett or really, Virginia Woolf, anybody, I do think Carlos Fuentes earns that space there, and I think Terra Nostra is the novel that earns it, because wow, what a ride, and I love it. It's such a baffling novel. You folks, if you've read Always the Wanderer, I love really baffling experimental fiction, and I think really highly of this. And there's so much going on that is so so puzzling that it's definitely one that I'll be thinking about for a long time to come. So let me know. Let me know in the comments. Are you going to read Terra Nostra? Have you read it? What do you think about this novel? I'm really curious. I love engaging with folks about what they think about the novel. So let me know if you're planning on reading this big novel, and let me know if you have read it, how you feel about it, and also if you have read this in translation in a different text or a different language. Let me know. I there are a few, pardon me, there are a few novels in the Spanish language that have really made me want to read in Spanish and get to and learn Spanish well enough that I would be able to read it. This is one of them. I would definitely I when I was reading this, I was definitely considering like, oh, maybe I should start taking Spanish classes and read this in the original, because this is definitely one that I would think of. But yeah, I want to thank you all so much for hanging out with me today and talking about Terra Nostra. I really appreciate it. As always, if you want to get to know more about me as a thinker, writer, novelist, you can head to my website, georgekors.com. I'm also on social media, Instagram and TikTok at gbk7288. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, if you want, please do read my novel, Always the Wanderer. You have my eternal thanks for doing that. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you so much.